Hello, everybody. This is Neha Gupta. I'm the CEO of True Office Learning. I'm very excited today to be chatting with Larry Bates. Larry, I will never do a good job on your introduction, given the extensive experience you have. So I'll actually would love to have you introduce yourself, and then I'll say a few words about myself, and then just really looking forward to the conversation today.
Well, thank you, Neha. It's a pleasure to be here and have this chance to talk with you. I've been serving as General Counsel of Panasonic Corporation, based here in Osaka, Japan, for a couple of years now. I've spent basically the last 30 years of my career in the legal area in Japan and China, having started with a couple of law firms, New York, China, then to Japan, then spent 22 years of my career with GE, General Electric Company here in Japan. Retired from there in 2013, but it was not a very long retirement.
I was gonna say.
Joined a Japanese publicly listed company called Lixil as their chief legal officer for 4 years. And then 2 years ago, as I mentioned, joined Panasonic in the first position of general counsel and also as a first, I believe, non-Japanese member of the board of directors.
Oh, that is fascinating. And I'm going to have to ask you about kind of the love for Asia Pacific region, but it's so good to be chatting with you because our experiences, while we both focus on the same domain of ethics and compliance, are so different, as I personally come more from the business and technology and data science side of the hub, but I've had responsibility for legal and compliance for organizations like Citigroup's institutional technology business. And it's such a good intermingling when kind of business, legal, and compliance and kind of that whole diaspora comes together. You said something really incredible about, being kind of Panasonic is a 102-year-old company. You mentioned that you're the first general counsel and the first sort of a member of the sort of executive committee who's non-Japanese. That personal journey must be incredible. What drew you to Asia Pacific, and how has that been kind of the part of the story? Because there's clearly a very strong bond there.
Well, if I could have predicted where I would end up way back when I started the study of Chinese language in university, I suppose I would be magic in some way, but I think that it's really difficult, especially with the pace at which things are moving globally, but even more so in Asia over the past 3 or 4 decades, to have predicted what the career opportunities might have been for anybody who had an interest in this area. For me, I knew that I wanted to study Chinese when I went to college and chose to go to Yale because it was one of the few places in the United States in the 1970s that had a Chinese program, and I was just fascinated by President Nixon's opening up to China, and followed that just with great interest, and so that was the opportunity I looked at, and I somehow imagined that I would end up in government or doing diplomatic work. But an opportunity came along when I finished Yale. The timing was right to do a Yale teaching program at a university in China for 2 years. I had applied to law school, but still thinking I would go to government. And I took a 2-year deferral and went back to law school and eventually became a corporate lawyer, having joined a law firm first in New York that within a year sent me to China to be the youngest associate ever to run their Beijing office. And so when I talk to young people today about careers in Asia, I said, you may or may not look at my example, but the one thing that you can learn, I think, is to be flexible and be open to what the possibilities might be, because things are changing so quickly.
I must say that must be a very good professor in Yale that taught that first class on Chinese language, because clearly it stuck with you. But I'm right there with you. I jokingly tell people, we now run a company that supports about 300 significant organizations around the world, help employees make better decisions. And if 10 years ago somebody would ask me, this is what I'd be doing, I would say, I'm not sure, right? To your point, some adjacent interests, but not quite, corporate policy versus private enterprise. So I think that's a pretty impressive shift to make. And I guess where the world is today probably makes things even more complicated between what's happening with public policy and enterprise.
And I think the other part of that, and you alluded to it, Neha, is that people need to think in developing their careers about what might suddenly happen that they cannot predict in terms of crisis as well. And we're all obviously facing the COVID-19 situation right now, but these things, happen in one degree or another from time to time. I had always an idea in my mind that I would want to study Japanese along with the Chinese at
Wow.
some point, never had time to. And then, in 1989, for better or worse, at least from a personal career perspective, I was based in Beijing, and we had the Tiananmen political crisis.
Yeah.
Business died overnight, and we had
Really.
to figure out whether I was going to go back to New York or come with my Chinese partner, whom I had met there, somewhere else, since he could not go to the U.S. at that
Wow.
point. And so we chose Japan, and this is where we are. So I think you got to always think about these unpredictable changes that may affect things and kind of run with them and make a virtue of a vice where you have to.
No, it is probably the most meaningful skill in the modern world, right? I mean, as you said, we're in the middle of a crisis currently as we speak, which I don't think anybody quite predicted or saw coming. But clearly, when you talk about transformation, both personal and having that flexibility in your careers, it's also very clear that there's a ton of business transformation that's happening at sort of Panasonic and beyond. How does somebody not lose kind of that historical legacy, but at the same time have this very future forward mindset where it is truly about change? It is truly about, being very attuned to the socioeconomic, to kind of the technological innovation and market changes that are constantly happening around us.
So for me, getting more directly to the Panasonic aspect of this and how that fit into my career, um, I was not looking at this point in my career for a further change. But Panasonic, of course, is one of the most iconic brands in Japanese corporate history.
Absolutely.
As you mentioned, 102 years. I was in the C-suite at Lixil, which was also a first-time position. Um, but what really attracted me was this idea that corporate Japan has had a lot of difficulty, a lot of challenge in figuring out how to adjust its
Mhm.
successful business model for so many years to a rapidly changing, truly global digitizing world. And to do that in a way that is consistent with, legal and compliance requirements around the globe multi-jurisdictionally. And I remember when I joined GE in Japan way back in 1992, it was in the midst of a compliance crisis where there was a bribery case
Wow.
involving the medical equipment business with two Japanese publicly owned universities. And for me, that was scary at first, but also for a lawyer who's interested in kind of cross-culture communication, kind of an exciting opportunity because it really meant how do I help the team there to build
Mhm.
a proper culture in a globalizing world from the ground up. And
Yeah.
when I talked to Panasonic, they happened to be, unfortunately, going through a similar situation a few years ago
Yeah.
with their Panasonic avionics business in the US.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think it had struck them in the course of their own business, now our business and cultural transformation, that we also really needed to think about what kind of a legal and compliance culture did we need to facilitate
Yeah.
that transformation. And for me, that's sort of been a theme in my career and something that really excited me about coming to this role.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of kind of standing in the eye of the storm. I always tell people that it makes you see things so much more clearly and affect change in a way that you never can when everything is just at status quo. So it makes a ton of sense that that's been the journey, and it sounds like that is probably what led to this sort of transformation to having a more formal general counsel role and having a much more, for the lack of a better word, structural approach to kind of going after building this culture.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And by the way, some of the best learning experiences come from various types of difficulties or
Yeah,
even crisis like that. But I think from Panasonic management's perspective, there were probably, you know, two aspects to their decision to want to bring somebody like me into this new role. I think one of them was the one I already mentioned, which was really the kind of legal and compliance cultural base, global infrastructure to deal with the reality of the world that we're now operating in 140 different countries, but at the same time trying to figure out what does it mean to have the Panasonic brand, which was built on a consumer
yeah,
kind of corporate culture in this new world, and how do we transform the company's business models and do that with the right legal support to hopefully get it right from the beginning. So I think it was really kind of a twofold aspect to my from their thinking to my joining the company.
yeah, and it is a touch of transformation because I actually remember owning a bunch of Panasonic electronic devices in my home, right? And it has been so fascinating to see how that whole world has changed and shifted. When you walked in, and I know you mentioned a little bit about kind of building the right culture, was there a lot of worry of you're the person that's going to come and say no to everything? Because I know that's sometimes part of the challenge people feel with transformation or kind of influencing that pivot, that a company needs.
Yeah, inevitably there, I suppose, has been some of that. Um, but one of the things that I've learned in Japanese corporate culture over the many years that I've been working here is that I think there's fundamentally a lot of integrity
Mm,
in Japanese corporate organizations, and a lot of the compliance misses that we see don't relate, so much to personal greed or the kind of personal aggrandizement or ego building that I think we're familiar with seeing in a more Western
sure.
corporate context, but
Yeah,
things that kind of go around, not knowing what the rules are, um, doing the wrong thing because everybody else does them, and that
yeah,
therefore must be right.
the
Not
norm.
getting not getting the right legal advice or input into the process. And so you have sort of this chain reaction of events that leads from something small to something potentially big.
Yeah,
And I think that has therefore for me been kind of an ongoing educational process. So my first effort in this culture change has really been to get the discussion going. We use the word transparency a lot, trying to get at all levels, whether it's the employee level or the top management level, regular discussions about risks that people face in their daily business operations, and how do we better address those risks and understand what they are.
yeah. That dialogue piece is so important. I was having a conversation with a large global organization, and they had a common scenario that can happen around obtaining some permits in an international location, and they just said, well, you have a project needs to be done by this deadline, but you can't pay facilitation fees because we don't support them as a business, and that's it. And I said, where's the discussion about what do you do then? Like, how do you come back and share that information and have a management and the tone for the top aligned to that and have kind of a process and pathway? So it's great to see that I couldn't agree more with the words education and transparency, because so often it's easy to say, well, this is what the black and white letter of the law says. You need to help people understand and digest how to actually apply it and make it a part of their lives.
Well, absolutely. And, I think one of the worst things, and this is what we're both saying, I think, for a legal or compliance person to find him or herself in the worst position is to say, I have to say no. You just can't do this because it's gotten to a point where there really is no other option.
Yeah.
And I think building the culture on the legal and compliance team where we are expected to be and we expect ourselves to be in the front line of discussions on important and daily business decisions is the best way of hopefully avoiding that unpleasant position of having to say no in the end, because we can figure out the right ways to approach things from the start through that discussion, which is, I think, what you're saying.
Hugely. I always tell people, I'm like, if you really want to know, what is the compliance culture amongst the bevy of metrics, one of them is, when does compliance get brought to the table? Is it all the way at the tail end to be the rubber stamp, or is it early enough in the process to have a conversation about how do we get this done?
And unfortunately, the reality has been here in Japan, and Panasonic, I think, was no exception to this, that historically, the legal function was really kind of a back office operation. And in most cases, and still is the case in many places today, the chief legal officer, if there is one, or the person in charge of the legal department inside any business operation, does not report directly to the CEO of that operation, does not participate in regular management meetings with that CEO and his or her immediate team, so that they're kind of, by structure, put in a position of having to be reactive and consulted only when they are come to. And so that's really been the biggest organizational challenge I've faced, since I joined Panasonic, is to really structure the organization and the mindset, both of management and of the legal team itself,
Yeah.
to work differently and to be perceived differently.
Yeah. I think, and it's interesting to hear you talk about these challenges, because I know that's a shift that now in the Western world, or in the United States, is slowly being made as well, where legal teams and compliance teams have a much more direct line of sight to the board, or direct line of sight to the C-suite or management. In terms of this dichotomy between the Japanese business environment and kind of US and other parts of the world, when you look at corporate governance, kind of as the world globalizes, I mean, the truth is, to your point, right, culture is now no longer an insular, sort of small one dimension kind of an existence, if you will. What kind of new roles or responsibilities do you think, as more of these shifts happen, that directors and senior managers will need to sort of make themselves from a governance perspective?
Yeah, those are really important questions, and I think it was not accidental that Panasonic's top management decided when they created my position that they would also make the position and me a member of the board, because I think that was sending a really powerful signal to the organization as a whole
Yeah.
about the importance they attach to compliance, legal, governance, risk, which are my kind of broad areas of responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think it also has to be seen as part of what has been a kind of ongoing transformation in Japanese corporate governance generally, but also at Panasonic over the last 5 to 10 years, with a new corporate governance code, with Panasonic's mentality from the beginning of that code to be that this is a comply or explain type model, that we're
Yeah.
going to comply with everything rather than explain why we're not complying with
Yeah.
certain things.
Yeah.
And so various things had been done even before I joined and are ongoing in terms of increasing the number of outside independent directors who are
Mm.
members of the board, so that the Japanese company as a whole becomes a little bit less insular
Yeah.
um, with respect to this lifetime system of executive employees, directors, managers, kind of all talking to themselves over many years. I
Yeah.
mean, so I think we're even before this coronavirus crisis, we're looking at big changes that are potentially going on here. And I think the crisis is probably going to accelerate some of those changes.
Yeah, in a lot of fronts, I've been saying in my discussions with peers and colleagues that I think the coronavirus probably accelerated, depending on what side of change you're looking at, whether it's virtualization of the workplace or whether it's the fact that you and I are having this conversation from halfway across the globe but not sitting face to face, right? All the way to how companies handle crisis and assess risk. I mean, there's a for the lack of a better word, a fast learning curve. I was joking and saying everybody's getting a crash course in change management right now, whether they wanted it or not.
Well, and I mean, the simplest, but in some ways the hardest aspect of that is just as you mentioned now, this technology and how do we use it at all levels of the organization. And so, we've been, as so many other companies have, working for home wherever we can be for, here in Japan, 6 months, 6 weeks to a couple of months now.
Yeah,
That's going to go on at least until the end of this month. I
yeah,
mean, there are huge cultural aspects to that in a place like Japan, where the personal contact, the face-to-face meetings, I think is true to some extent all over Asia,
yeah.
have been extremely important in order to build trust, close communication. Even email is considered sometimes a less desirable alternative. And so really to get people used to this way of communication in their day-to-day work from
Mm,
home, and where homes in Japan, may not be on average the same size
yeah.
as they are in certain other countries, where we now have kids in school from home. I have that challenge too. I think this is a huge culture change, and it's a crash course. But I think it may also go beyond some of those things as we, in terms of permanent change, I think what is going to be the right optimal way of working going forward. And I think this may start in people's minds to open up possibilities of what they can do and how they can do it in many ways that they might not have imagined before.
Do you feel at all, Larry, that ethics and compliance may be at a disadvantage? Because in some ways, they're such well-established kind of professions, and there are organizational structures that have been in place for such a long period of time. When I think of even people's investigations processes and so many things, right? There's for the lack of a better word, uh, so much precedence, but also then frankly not necessarily a bench of talent, if you will, that's very technologically oriented. Do you see that becoming a bigger gap as this crisis and our response to it progresses?
Yeah, I mean, those are really good questions, and a number of things occur to me. Um, I don't think there's any magic solution that says just because we're all learning how to use these technology tools, that's going to be the future.
Yeah.
Um, because I think everything in the end is going to have to be an optimal balance
Yeah.
of building personal relationships and trust and leveraging technology maybe more intelligently, and this maybe could help to that. But if I look at compliance, one of the oldest arguments that I've been having through my career is how do you go about training people on compliance? And there's been, as you know, a huge move in recent decades to doing online training, and in some cases moving 100% exclusively to that. you
Hmm.
know it there's a danger with that, which is
Yeah.
that you don't get the personal engagement, you don't build the personal trust. People cannot ask open-ended questions that might be bothering them, um, and get kind of face-to-face interaction. So I think there's got to be a combination of that online training, which we can track and measure country to country, business to business, but at the same time for high risk groups, targeted in-person training. And I think we're going to face that same conversation in every aspect of compliance. We've got to do more with the digital tools. For the
Yeah.
record, to make our work more efficient, especially at the lower value add part of the chain,
Yeah.
while spending our time really more and more face to face on those higher priority, higher risk areas.
Could not agree more. This is one of the reasons why kind of our work in adaptive learning and providing the risk intelligence back to the companies has invariably what we encourage people to do with that data is not, oh, okay, I've met the requirements and yes, I know I've presented everything that was needed and people applied it, but actually taking that insight back and choosing the next time you're on that trip to the office, which group should you meet with first or which country should you visit first, and get that dialogue and that focus group conversation going. Because again, right, the good and bad is the technology can make the process a lot more efficient, and if you're using technology well, it can give you better insight to use your live time, if you will, or the in-person investment be a lot more effective as well. But we're going to continue to see the shift. And you talked a little bit about it, this crisis is certainly accelerating it, but without question, um, this brings an acceleration. But in general, I think now the world is a lot more attuned to thinking about crisis management than they did maybe even 6 months ago necessarily. Do you think this is going to become kind of a routine exercise now? And what changes, if you will, from a perspective of kind of how organizations are probably going to be best served in trying to think about crisis management going forward?
Well, maybe if I look at it, I think there's maybe two aspects to your question. I think there's risk kind of management processes more broadly, and then I think there's crisis management per se. And I guess starting with that crisis management piece, um, one of the things that I've noticed in my three companies that I've worked for is that there's a tendency at first for people to think of crisis as something that magically appears as crisis, and everybody recognizes it's crisis.
Yeah.
Right, but I think there's got to be a much more conscious kind of what I prefer to call issue identification and escalation process, because when something happens or emerges, and even if we look at coronavirus as an example, we were starting to read about this in early January
Yeah.
as an issue in China. All right, but how many of us were actually, thinking of this in a crisis context for the rest of our operations or the rest of our lives around the world? And so, do we need to have in place, and this is only one example, but a big
Mm-hmm.
one, but kind of more detailed rules, if you will, more detailed guidance to people in the field of the types of issues that need to be escalated sooner and how to escalate them to where, so that we then kind of address them with the right members of a team and be prepared for various types of scenario planning. I think that maybe will be a key lesson on crisis management that we all have to take from that. And it
Yeah.
goes for not just companies, but our lives, governments, what have you.
Across the board, and that's why I always there is a study by one of the I think it is actually from the Harvard School of Psychology, and they invariably do a little test if you're paying attention, and you're asked to count how many times a ball hands off between a team. And what most people don't notice in that counting is there's a moonwalking bear that dances across the screen, and they'll rewind it and show you that yes, the moonwalking bear is there. And to your point, right, crisis doesn't just suddenly appear. It's just everybody's focused so much elsewhere that they've kind of missed the signs as they kind of walk through the screen. Which I guess to your point, is going to require a better machine for both how you're measuring day-to-day risks, how you're communicating those risks, how are you coordinating across all these global partners to make sure that one person's risk that has the possibility of impacting a host of other sort of downstream risks is being caught and being caught early. What do you find to be most kind of challenging about measuring and assessing this risk tangibly going forward, especially in a global environment where one size honestly just won't fit all, right? There's no such thing as your gold standard assessment that works for everything.
Well, that then relates, I think, to the second aspect of risk, which I management, which I wanted to mention, and we've been working on, even before this pandemic issue came to light, which is, I think, in many Japanese companies, but I'm not sure it's limited to Japanese companies. There's a tendency to kind of do a bottoms-up approach to risk that comes from each company, each business division within the company, each region, specific to that company or region, without necessarily balancing that or kind of driving that with a top-down strategy-based risk focus, where these individual risks that might be identified and worked on actually, if they do have group-wide or company-wide implications, really get addressed and treated that way with the proper KPIs and countermeasures as to what the impact could be and how do you mitigate them, that they get dealt with and validated by the board or top management as strategic risks that could appear for the company as a whole and what the impact of that might be. I think there's really a tendency, I notice in particular in Japanese companies, to silo this risk management process in particular areas, and that information doesn't get shared. The resources don't get dedicated on a group-wide basis if it has group-wide potential risk. And that's something that we're working on. And in fact, I'm going with a proposal to the board on this month as to how to create more of a top-down strategic enterprise risk management process, because I think it goes to what you're talking about.
Hugely, and I think it's great to hear you kind of share that, because I noticed you also serve as the chief risk officer for Panasonic, right? And that is
Right.
in some ways unique in a lot of organizations, because many organizations that have very structured risk processes, risk is kind of its own separate hat. And yes, there's overlap with legal and compliance, but what really crosses the boundaries is always a little dubious.
Well, that's really a constant question of discussion that we have here as well. Where does risk really belong? And I think it's a very hard question to answer, especially for a company like ours, which is not highly regulated. I mean, we do have regulation that affects all our business, but we're not pharmaceutical.
Yeah.
We're not financial. In those types of industries, I remember GE, we had nuclear energy. You have very regulatory dictated risk processes. And I think that in some ways that's an easier context to deal with because it's structured for you. Here, we have to figure out, vaguely under requirements of the Tokyo Stock Exchange and the securities law, what do we as a manufacturing and business solutions provider have to do in terms of properly identifying what our key risks are, what our BC plans are for them, and how we're managing them. So it's a constant question.
But you know what? It's one that I always say, much like your point about governance reporting lines, and like it's one worth asking, or at least agreeing and acknowledging that multiple groups own that risk landscape. So at least there should be a good enough information exchange, because as many of us kind of see, whether it's innovation or whether it's transformation or even issue identification, one of the things that lies commonly to the root of it, and where sort of my personal passion for data science and cognitive science comes from, is data is often at the root of figuring out the what, the why, and often sometimes even in driving the how, right? What ways are you using data that you find unique, either to the Japanese culture or to Panasonic, or just to your experience based on the wide work that you've done, that you feel brings kind of its own layer of clarity, if you will, to this risk landscape?
Well, I think there's the aspect of that which relates specifically to legal and compliance, and maybe I'll come back to that in a second.
Yeah.
But I think to put it in context, a big part of Panasonic's transformation is really how do we move from what has traditionally been a hardware company, as I mentioned, mostly
consumer
and consumer electronics, appliances and electronics areas, but to something that is much more B2B. You look at the huge investment we've made in automotive, factory automation, to solutions for B2B customers, where there may be B2B to C aspects with lots of data that we potentially have access to with respect not only to our B customers, but our C customers. This all requires putting in place new software platforms for all of our business units. I mean, in the appliances and housing area, we're calling that lifestyle updates. But you know, in our connected solutions business, we're coming up with solutions on things like logistics and distribution systems and supply chain management for B2B customers. All of this involves huge amounts of effort with data and potentially risk that we as a legal and compliance function need to help, you know, manage from the start as we build these new business models. So that's kind of the company context. But I think in terms of how we as legal and compliance are actually leveraging some of these tools, I mean, the one that we probably spent the most time on in the last year or so is simply a global, I mean, it's not simple, but simply a global third-party tracker in light of the bribery case, you know, that I alluded to with Panasonic Avionics. Is how do we get even an inventory where the business was very decentralized across the globe of the tens of thousands of third-party service providers, distributors, go-to-market agents that we have in our different businesses, who they are, where they are, what's the risk assessment process as to what level of due diligence needs to be done on them, collecting all of that data in one tool that if we do, you know, unfortunately, hope not have an issue in the future, we can show that we've done what we need to do in the best risk assessed or prioritized way. So, I mean, to me, that's an example of an IT tool and building of data that I think in the long term will make us a much stronger company and also make the lives of our legal and compliance and also our business colleagues easier. But that's just one of many of the types of examples that we're working on in that area.
It's fantastic to hear you talk about that because again, right, data is again one of those areas that has traditionally been more foreign to ethics and compliance because it's much more about laws and regulations and all of that. But the truth is, and it's interesting to see you bring up the third-party example because when we look across our behavioral benchmarking database of about 2 billion or so data points, about 11 million or so users around the globe, one of the biggest areas that they have difficulty in anti-corruption is around identifying that asking a government official as part of due diligence for a third party is not a good idea, which is, you know, again, you don't want that politically exposed person influencing that decision, but data is amazing once you can kind of get your arms around it, how much it can uncover and how much it can help you figure out kind of where that risk profile can shift or change. Conduct data is something that we are finding increasingly, to your point, even in this third-party risk area, that people are having the hardest time trying to kind of get their arms around, right? Which is how does country A handle this process versus country B versus country C, and how did that due diligence kind of pan out, and who are the people who are actually able to really kind of meet the bar that you would hold probably as global Panasonic, and where there might be still some areas you want to look at.
And I think you raise a broader aspect of building global compliance infrastructure in that context, which is and you know, this question of whether one shoe size can fit all. We have to have minimum standards, and this is the way we've been trying to approach things, because most Japanese companies, I think, have decentralized quite a lot, and Panasonic was among them over the years, and there's an absence of what would be truly global policies in a number of areas, including this one of anti-bribery. We've moved quickly to address that, obviously, but then you have to be careful. What are your minimum standards under these various policies? And you got to make sure that everybody in different cultures and business contexts can at least comply with those. There may need to be stricter standards in some places where the laws are stricter, or the business practices are different, but you may have different interpretations of how to actually implement that depending on unique business practices and risks in certain areas, as long as you're complying with what's hopefully the right minimum standard.
So since you share that as part of the challenge, I got to ask you, how do you handle training and communications when in that multicultural, multi-geographic, there's a baseline probably that's standard to everybody, but then so many levels up and down, right? Depending on where they are.
Yeah, so you know, for me, that was really one of the highest priorities when I first joined the company, is what does the organization structure look like, and what are the obstacles or the opportunities to implement, you know, what we've just been talking about from a compliance infrastructure perspective. And because of the decentralization over the years, the legal and compliance function as well was pretty much siloed by company, by region, by corporate function, and not a lot of communication going on a day-to-day basis among those different pieces of the organization. So I moved within 1 year of my arriving to creating a vertically integrated structure where basically all of the legal and compliance function, a few exceptions here and there for acquisitions, which themselves are global acquisitions, but in principle, all of the legal and compliance team needs to report up through the region or through the company into me. This is not the way things have traditionally been done in Panasonic, and I think that has sent a strong message, again, in line with my being on the board, as to the importance of legal and compliance. And I may not have done that way if I had done it that way if I had you know, joined a global US company, because I think in many US companies the idea of a matrix organization is already in people's DNA, and that you have a functional boss and a business boss, right? And people are used to working that way. HR systems are structured that way. But I thought we needed to send a particularly strong message here on the other side of the pendulum, while of course people continue to operate as part of their business and regional teams.
Where does it? Absolutely. And it is so fascinating to hear you share these stories, because to your point, in the US, that matrix structure is so innate to us that, you know, you almost get amazed if somebody doesn't have one at certain roles or functions within the organization. So that is definitely a big step in terms of change. But again, it's all about,
and still a work in progress, I mind you.
Well, it seems like you're making the right strides in sending that message, you know, all the way from top down and bottom up, because I'm sure for people as well over time, one of the things I have seen from companies that have made these kind of shifts is that alignment over time makes their job easier. And so you slowly build internal momentum about kind of people feeling a bit more empowered and a bit more part of the whole, if you will, than necessarily these business units.
I don't want to overemphasize it, but it was striking to me, you know, within the first few weeks that I joined in April of 2018, that my own corporate headquarters team in this compliance area did not feel comfortable. And I mentioned that we need to put in place lots of global policies, global processes, but they did not feel empowered, to use your word, to go out to the regions or go out to the companies within the group and say, you know, this is the initiative that we want to drive and why we need to drive it from headquarters perspective. There was just no mindset, even among themselves, that they could we do that?
Could we do that? Yeah, yeah.
You know, so that's really changed quite a lot, I have to say, in a positive way, I think.
That's fantastic. So since we're talking about positive shades and small wins and all things that kind of add up to some big change, you know, I know that many of the legal and ethics and compliance professionals who are going to be listening to this conversation, without question, probably hear your story and some of the things that we see across the organizations, and can feel that, wow, if they are willing to push, there is truly a next frontier, and there is a way to change or disrupt the status quo, if you will, and keep moving towards a better world. I know that I won't ask you to forecast the future, because we all are living on a day by day world, if you will. But it'd be great to hear a little bit more about, as you look at the horizon of where the landscape is, and frankly even the crisis we're in the middle of. What do you find yourself sort of the most optimistic about when you look at the next 6 months and kind of into the next year?
Well, I'm not sure all of this is necessarily optimistic, but if we're looking at the at the future, I mean, we have to be optimistic by definition,
Yeah.
but I think we're going to see an acceleration. We've already talked about this, of trends toward digitization, use of AI, both in business models and in the way that we work every day, including in legal and compliance. And so, I feel in a sense it was a really almost precious decision on my part. I don't want to brag about it too much, to bring on an associate general counsel a couple of years ago, soon after I joined, virtually based in the UK, whose job as a lawyer is to promote legal innovation. So these
Mm.
are exactly the types of things she's looking at. I know that's very common in US companies, but it wasn't common here. And I think after a lot of difficulty in figuring out how to work with an organization like ours, with it
Yeah.
through the language and through the traditions, her value is starting to be shown. And I think this crisis, in a way, in this whole area, I think is going to be an accelerator for that. So
Yeah.
I do see that as a positive.
I agree.
And I guess there's also emerging risks, though, that I think are going to get more pronounced, and we're going to have to be strongly on top of. So I don't know whether to call that a positive or not, but I think it's a reality, and this may help us realize it. So that's in a sense a positive. But this geopolitical tension between, first and foremost, the United States and China, I think this crisis is going to make that problem likely worse. I think it's going to globalize it further, in a sense. I think globalization itself is going to come under greater challenge. I think this has very practical implications for companies and for our function. So, looking at things like trade controls and sanctions and the importance of government relations, these are going to become increasingly important, I have no doubt. And as a Japanese company, how do we, maneuver inside of that global environment where both China and the United States are very, very important key markets and important for innovation? This is going to be a moving area.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And look, there is a silver lining to your point about the evolving risk landscape, because I've been telling professionals that if there was ever a time that the ethics, compliance, and legal function can make a material difference to the business, this crisis opens the door widely for that, because the landscape is going to get so murky for a little while the regulations aren't going to stop, or they're not going to get any easier. You're still going to be held accountable to all the standards of doing business the right way. But at the same time, to your point, just like sanctions and geopolitical risk, most of the organizations we're dealing with are working through a lot of challenges, from everything on tackling bias and fraud and kind of all the ramifications from a conduct perspective, right, to information security and protecting IP and doing all these things, and kind of all these shifts and phases that in the next 6 months, I say, the function has a real chance to be the rock stars that kind of save the day a little bit as we enter new territory.
Well, those are rousing words for people in our function. I mean, I think the other aspect of this is that the uh, the information travels so quickly now, and we've got these global supply chains that I think are coming under great scrutiny in the context of
Yeah.
coronavirus, but even before that, um, with this trade sanctions challenge, how do you manage your supply chains? Media are taking an incredible interest in the integrity of these supply chains, their human rights practices, their labor, environmental practices,
Yeah.
and information then travels over social media so quickly that you can assume that anything you say on any of these issues anywhere in the world in
Yeah.
response to any politician, any external stakeholder, any media organization is going to be quickly reported everywhere else. So
Yeah.
everything in that sense will have even more of a global implication, while, I think globalization itself is going to be under challenge.
It's a fun time to be a leader, right?
Absolutely.
It is, and your point about information traveling so quickly is so fascinating because now we're beginning to see a push in the industry, to your point about utilizing more AI and all of that, even in learning, where, people are saying, me, I've been an employee for so many years, you should know by now what I know well and what I don't know well and where I need help. And so we're beginning to use a lot of that behavioral insight to shape the ongoing journey for a learner. But to your point, I think everybody's going to have to shift their approach and scale up or scale differently to meet the needs of the new employee, but also the new organization and the third parties that surround them.
Well, that what you just said reminds me of something we touched on earlier, is to what extent we can rely on the technology going forward. I've already, I think we've already talked that we can't do that exclusively, though it will become more important. I mean, I'm in the fortunate position, and most of us at a more senior level are, of having learned the organization, knowing the stakeholders,
Yeah.
having traveled. If we look at people, sort of in the earlier stages of their careers, who don't know the company and don't know the organization yet. And if we're going to do things like, for a while, cut down significantly on business travel and rely more on technology, how are we going to enable them to, build themselves into the type of future leaders that we want, with the trust they need to earn with the various stakeholders? So I think that's going to be a challenge that we face going forward,
Yeah.
depending on how this goes.
We onboarded a few employees, and I felt that was kind of hard to do, as our headquarters are in New York and that's the epicenter. So definitely not visiting HQ. But I know somebody who recently joined an organization as their CEO and is going to do that process virtually. And I just couldn't for the life of me imagine doing
Right?
that,
Yeah.
because how do you not meet the management team? How do you not get to know the employees? How do you and everything that comes with it?
Right. Exactly. So I think there just needs to be, maybe, and this is a good way to kind of sum up some of my thoughts, but um, and I see this in particular in the Japanese organization, but I think it's true everywhere. Change comes slowly, especially here in Japan. But I think it comes, and I think maybe we can leverage a little bit of the learnings from what we're going through right now to accelerate it. But I think the messaging, the communication, has to be persistent, consistent. Uh, we have to sometimes repeat ourselves a little bit more than we would like, because organization is huge. We're operating on many different levels in that organization. I think the consistency and the persistence of that communication is really important, while at the same time, we need to build in better skills always at listening to see what the real challenges in implementation people's, you know, daily
Actual
lives
lives
are.
are. Yeah.
And I just think that's how we have to keep reminding ourselves of the importance of that, even if for a while we're going to rely so much on this type of communication that you and I are having right now.
Absolutely. So is there, Larry, as we wrap up the conversation, it's been so fascinating to cover so many dimensions of the landscape, if you will. both so I've personally worked in Asia, but for a small stint in India, but I know that even the cultures within Asia Pacific are so different, with some common threads across. As somebody who's now obviously New York domiciled, um, what's one sort of advice you would give to others that are looking to either improve kind of their management of global teams, or are looking to just be a little bit savvier in how they deal with counterparts in Asia Pacific? I think given your wide array of experiences in the region, that would be just I think really helpful for our folks to hear before we break for the day.
Wow, that's a tough question that I had not necessarily prepared for. Um, and it's really a tough answer, a tough question in particular in the context of COVID-19, because, my traditional sort of first off the cuff advice to younger people is that you to be globally and cross-culturally effective, you really should develop those skills at some point early in your career, um, to the extent possible, face to face, on the ground. And we know that right now it's going to be difficult to follow that advice. Hopefully, that will be short lived. I think in the meantime, though, in terms of kind of becoming more globally sensitive and following that interest as one I think should have in any kind of organization these days, really try to read up on, the cultures, the history, the political issues of what's going on in the country, the context of whoever you're dealing with in your business organization. I think that context for people goes a long way in being effective and shows understanding, compassion, interest in dealing with whatever the immediate business issue of the day is. I think it cannot be, people don't realize how appreciated that is. I mean, you're a global person. I've had that experience for years. People really appreciate when you take the effort to understand where they come from and what's going on in their area of the world. And so I guess that's probably the next best thing that you can do, in the absence of actual face-to-face experience. And use the time, if you're interested in a language, to do some language learning, which can
Yeah.
be done anywhere. Why not?
To your point about that, I mean, empathy and understanding, there couldn't be better notes than that to kind of end our conversation on today. And I don't disagree. One of the reasons, even though I'm born and raised here, I went to work in India, is I was like, literally, I want to go across the world and see how an entirely different culture functions at work, because it's such an amazing thing to learn. But to your point, even a few words of a foreign language that you put in the effort to learn go a long way.
Exactly right. Well,
Fantastic. Larry,
I've
thank you
really
so
enjoyed
much.
this.
Very, very much the same. I wish that this was more in person, as we've kind of both been saying. I think there is, without question, something to be said for being able to meet. But I really appreciate you taking the time. I know that right now both of us are in respective lockdowns halfway across the world, but I know this conversation was very helpful for all the practitioners listening to us. So thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you again, and good health to you and your colleagues. And I look forward to talking again, hopefully in person.
You as well. Have a great one.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.